The sun was slipping low behind the jagged ridges, staining the New Mexico sky in hues of rust and gold. Dust hung in the air, shimmering like smoke over the small, half-forgotten village of Red Creek. The place had once been lively, cowhands crowding the saloon after long rides, women carrying baskets from the general store, children chasing stray chickens through the dirt lanes. Now most of the laughter had gone with the years, leaving behind weathered boards, broken fences, and a silence that carried the weight of stories no one dared to retell. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, the outline of his horse cutting sharp against the setting sun. His hat was tipped low, shadowing his face, and his coat was coated in dust from the long trail. He had the look of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little, the kind of man who drifted from one town to another, never staying long enough for roots to take hold. Folks in Red Creek noticed strangers, especially these days, and by the time he rode up to the watering trough outside the tavern, eyes were already watching from windows cracked just enough to see through. The man dismounted slow, stretching his back with a groan, his boots scuffing the dirt. He didn't carry more than a saddlebag and an old rifle slung over his shoulder, tools of someone used to sleeping under stars, not roofs. He led his horse to water, his reflection rippling in the trough. He didn't know yet that the moment his boots touched Red Creek soil, he was stepping into a story much older than himself, one carved by loss, by silence, and by the haunting song of an Apache widow. Behind the tavern, the wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of something strange, a voice almost like a whisper, brushing through the dry grass. Most men would have missed it, but he paused. Maybe it was the way the air turned colder for just a second, or maybe he'd lived long enough to know when something unseen was near. He turned, scanning the dimming hills beyond the village, his hand resting instinctively on the revolver at his belt. Nothing moved, just the slow roll of tumbleweed across the empty street. He walked into the tavern, the hinges creaking as if protesting against time. The smell of whiskey and old wood met him. A few faces looked up, studied him, then went back to their quiet drinking. The barkeep, a man with tired eyes and a limp, gave a small nod. "Ain't seen you before," he said. "Just passing through," the stranger answered, setting his hat on the counter. "Looking for a place to rest my horse and maybe a bed for the night." "There's a room upstairs," the barkeep said. "Ain't much, but it's dry." He paid in coins dulled by travel, then took a seat in the corner. He didn't notice her at first, the woman sitting by the window wrapped in a shawl dark as the desert night. Her hair was long, braided neatly and streaked with silver that caught the lantern's light. Her face carried the calm of someone who'd stopped fearing what others thought long ago. When she finally lifted her gaze, their eyes met, and he froze. There was something ancient in her stare, something that made the noise of the tavern fade into nothing. She didn't smile, didn't look away, just studied him with the quiet intensity of someone who saw more than a man's face. It was as if she looked right through him, to the roads he'd ridden, the choices he'd made, and the ghosts he carried. "Evening," he said after a long silence. "Evening," she replied softly, her voice carrying a weight that was neither friendly nor cold, just honest. He thought about asking who she was, but something in her stillness warned him not to. Instead, he nodded and looked down at his drink, but the air had changed. He could feel her gaze, steady as the desert moon, and it unsettled him. When he looked up again, she was gone, vanished as quietly as she'd appeared. Later that night, after the tavern had emptied and the wind had picked up, he stepped outside to smoke. The town slept in uneasy silence. Only the faint sound of a coyote echoed from the hills. He turned toward the barn at the far end of the street. His horse was tied there, restless and stamping. The animal wasn't usually skittish, but tonight it pawed the dirt, ears twitching toward the dark. He followed its gaze. Beyond the barn, he saw her again. The same woman from the tavern, standing where the moonlight broke over the grass. Her shawl fluttered slightly, but her face was calm. She didn't move until he took a cautious step forward. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he called quietly. "Neither should you," she answered, her tone neither warning nor welcome. "The desert doesn't rest after dark." He hesitated. "You live here?" "I used to," she said, "before they took it from me." Something in the way she said it chilled him. "Who?" he asked. She looked past him, toward the hills where old homesteads lay in ruins. "Men who thought the land would forget." Her voice softened. "But the land never forgets." He didn't know what to say, but she turned then, her eyes catching his in the half-light. "Don't look away," she whispered. "If you do, you'll never understand." Before he could ask what she meant, she started walking toward the edge of the barn. Against his better judgment, he followed. The night air grew heavier, carrying the scent of smoke, of rain that never came, and of something ancient and grieving. Inside the barn, moonlight spilled through broken boards, silvering the hay and tools left to rust. She stood near an old beam, her hand tracing something carved into the wood. Symbols, faint but deliberate. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly. "What is that?" She didn't answer right away. "It's a mark for those who wait," she said finally. "For those who remember what was taken." Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched one of the carvings, then turned to face him. "You're not like the others," she said. "You still see?" He frowned. "See what?" "The truth," she said simply. "The desert shows it to those who've lost everything." The wind whistled through the cracks and the horses outside shifted uneasily. She stepped closer, her voice barely more than breath. "You came here for rest," she said. "But rest doesn't live here anymore." He tried to speak, but something in her presence stole the words from him. She reached out, her hand hovering near his face, not touching, just close enough for him to feel the warmth of it. "There's a way the widows of the Apache remember their dead," she murmured. "It's not with tears. It's with truth." Her eyes glistened in the dim light. "And truth demands that you look." The horses neighed suddenly, breaking the stillness. He turned for a second, just a second, but when he looked back, she was gone. The barn stood empty except for the whispering wind and the faint scent of sage. He ran outside, scanning the fields, but there was nothing. Only the moon casting pale light over the sand. From somewhere far beyond the hills came the distant echo of a woman's song. It wasn't loud, but it filled the night with something he couldn't name, something between sorrow and calling. He stood there, heart pounding, unsure if he'd met a living woman or a memory that refused to fade. And yet her words lingered in his mind, wrapping around him like smoke. "Don't look away." He didn't know it yet, but those words would follow him through every shadow of Red Creek, pulling him deeper into a mystery older than the town itself, a story written in blood, silence, and the unbroken spirit of a widow who would not rest until her truth was seen. The wind rose again, carrying her whisper through the night, and he knew that sleep would not come. Morning came slow to Red Creek. The first light broke over the mesas, turning the sky pale gold and painting long shadows over the cracked earth. Roosters crowed somewhere behind the stables and smoke began to rise from the few chimneys that still worked. The town was small, but it had that old stubbornness about it, like it refused to die, no matter how many years of dust and silence tried to swallow it whole. The stranger woke with a start, the memory of the night still fresh in his mind. The sound of the woman's voice echoed faintly, her words sharp as a blade. "Don't look away." He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, rubbing his eyes, trying to make sense of it. He had ridden through plenty of lonely towns before, seen ghosts in faces of the living and regrets in the eyes of men who had nothing left to lose. But this felt different. It wasn't fear that stirred in him. It was something heavier, like the past itself had brushed against him and refused to let go. He went downstairs to the tavern. The barkeep was sweeping, the faint smell of coffee rising from a pot on the stove. "Mornin'," the old man said without looking up. "Mornin'," he replied, pulling a chair near the window. The streets outside were waking up, one man hauling hay, another fixing a wagon wheel. But even in the daylight, Red Creek seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something that never came. "Quiet place," he said. "Always has been," the barkeep muttered. "Quieter since the mines shut down. Folks left. Those who stayed don't talk much." He stopped sweeping for a moment and glanced toward the window. "You're not the first drifter to pass through, but I'll give you some advice. Don't wander too far after sundown." The stranger looked up. Because of the widow? The broom froze midair. The old man's shoulders stiffened before he slowly set it aside. "So you've heard." "I saw her," the stranger said quietly. The barkeep's eyes widened. "You saw her?" "Last night?" He nodded. "Out by the barn." The man lowered his voice, his tone almost reverent. "Most folks think she's a ghost. Others say she's still alive, living somewhere near the old Apache Ridge. Lost her husband in the raids long ago. The soldiers came, burned their camp. Only she survived. Since then, people say she walks between this world and the next. Shows herself to those who carry guilt." "I don't carry guilt," the stranger said. "Maybe not yours," the barkeep murmured. "But guilt finds everyone out here sooner or later." The words hung in the air. The stranger finished his coffee in silence, the warmth doing little to chase the chill running through him. Later that day, he took a walk through the outskirts of the village. The desert stretched wide, dotted with sagebrush and cacti, the horizon shimmering under the noon heat. The wind carried the faint rattle of dry leaves and the far-off cry of a hawk. He found himself drawn toward the hills beyond the barn, the same direction the woman had gone. There were remnants of old life there. Broken fences swallowed by sand, bits of pottery half buried, the skeletal frame of what once might have been a home. He knelt beside a fallen beam and saw markings carved deep into the wood, the same kind he had seen in the barn, spirals and lines etched with care, old symbols that seemed to hum with quiet meaning. He ran his fingers over them. "For those who remember what was taken," she had said. Behind him, footsteps crunched softly. He turned, hand near his revolver. It was a young boy, maybe 12, thin and sunburned, carrying a bucket. "You shouldn't be out here," the boy said. "Neither should you," the stranger replied. The boy shrugged. "I come to get water from the spring. Ain't many wells left working." He paused, studying the stranger with curiosity. "You're the one who came last night, ain't you?" "Seems word travels fast," the boy smirked. "Ain't much else to talk about in Red Creek. You see her?" He hesitated. "Who?" "The widow," the boy whispered. "My grandma says she was part Apache, part settler. Says she used to heal people with herbs and prayers. But when the army came, they thought she was helping her husband's tribe. Burned her home, took her son. She went mad after that." The stranger frowned. "And now?" The boy glanced toward the ridge. "Now she makes the desert remember." The boy's tone was so certain it made him uneasy. He wanted to ask more, but the boy was already heading back toward town, leaving a trail of dust behind. He stood alone again, the silence pressing against him. The wind shifted, and for just a moment he thought he heard a faint hum, like that same soft song from the night before. He followed it. The sound led him down a narrow trail that wound between dry hills. The farther he walked, the quieter the world became, until only his own heartbeat filled the air. Then he saw it, a cluster of stones arranged in a small circle, each one marked with those same carved symbols. In the center lay a single white feather, perfectly still despite the wind. He crouched, staring at it. There was something sacred here, something that felt both peaceful and sorrowful. As he reached out to touch the feather, the air grew colder. "Don't," came a voice from behind him. He turned sharply. She stood there again, the same woman from the night before. Her eyes were steady, calm but commanding. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "This place remembers what men choose to forget." "I didn't mean disrespect," he said. You followed the song," she interrupted. "It called you." He didn't deny it. "What is this place?" "A memory," she said. "For those who were taken. For those who were buried without names." He glanced around at the stones. "You made this?" She nodded. "Every one of them holds a story. My husband, my child, my people." Her voice trembled slightly, then steadied again. "You can still hear them if you listen." The stranger looked away, uneasy. "I've buried people too, but the dead don't talk where I come from." "They do," she said quietly. "You just stopped listening." The wind rustled through the brush, carrying with it the faint sound of chanting, low and rhythmic, as if the earth itself was remembering. He couldn't tell if it was real or just his mind trying to make sense of the silence. She stepped closer, studying him. "You came from far away," she said. "Running from something." He didn't answer. "It follows you," she continued. "You wear it like dust." He met her gaze. "You read people well." "I read what the desert shows me." She turned, kneeling beside one of the stones. "The desert never lies." He wanted to ask how she knew so much about him, but before he could speak, a sharp whistle broke the stillness. She froze. From somewhere up the ridge came the echo of hooves, riders, fast and many. He turned toward the sound, scanning the horizon. "Who's that?" "Men who still hunt ghosts," she said. "They don't believe in peace, only silence." She stood, pulling her shawl tighter. "Go back to town. Don't look for me again. I can help," he offered. Her voice dropped. "I'll keep them busy." Before he could argue, the riders burst into view. Gunfire cracked, echoing through the canyon. The widow turned, her shawl billowing like smoke, and the air around her seemed to change. The wind rose, sharp and violent, scattering dust in spirals. The horses reared, panicked. One man fired wildly into the air before being thrown. Another screamed as the wind whipped harder. sand cutting across his face like glass. The stranger didn't wait to see more. He rode hard toward the chapel, clutching the box. The sound behind him was chaos. Gunfire, shouting, the unearthly howl of the wind. When he looked back, the ridge was shrouded in dust, the widow's figure barely visible through it, standing tall against the storm. By the time he reached Red Creek, the streets were nearly empty. The townsfolk had shut their doors, the few faces in the windows watching silently as he rode past. The sky had turned strange, dark clouds rolling from the hills though there was no rain. He stopped outside the chapel. The doors were shut tight. Inside he could hear faint movement. He pushed them open and stepped in. The air was thick, heavy with candle smoke. The cross at the front gleamed faintly in the light. Reverend Harlan stood there, alive, his coat dusty but his eyes burning. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said. The stranger set the box on the table between them. "You led them to their deaths," he said. "All for land and gold." Harlan's mouth tightened. "It was war. You don't understand. The Apache raided settlements, killed women and children. That's not what these papers say." The stranger opened the box, pulling out the letters. This was revenge. "Orders signed by your own hand." Harlan stepped forward, voice rising. "You think you know what justice is? I did what needed to be done. I built this town from the ashes. Everything you see, the chapel, the fields, the homes, they exist because I had the will to do what others couldn't." The stranger's voice was low. "You built it on bones." Harlan's hand went to his pistol. "And I'll bury you with them if I have to." Before he could draw, a gust of wind blew through the chapel, snuffing out the candles. The doors slammed shut, the air filled with the faint sound of humming, the same haunting tone that had echoed through the ridge. Harlan froze, eyes wide. "She's here," he whispered. The wind rose, rattling the windows. The cross on the wall trembled. The stranger backed away, clutching the box. Harlan stumbled toward the altar, his face pale. "No," he muttered. "You can't. I did God's work." A voice soft but clear filled the room. "You did yours, not his." The stranger turned. The widow stood in the doorway, her shawl drifting in the wind. Her eyes were calm, but her presence filled the space like a storm barely held back. Harlan's voice broke. "You're dead. You can't be here." Her gaze didn't waver. "You took my life. You took my son's. But you couldn't take the truth." The candles flickered back to life on their own, their flames blue-white. Harlan stumbled backward, clutching the cross. "I built this town in his name," he shouted. "I gave them order." "You gave them silence," she said softly. "And silence is not peace." The stranger could feel the air tightening, the pressure building as if the whole chapel were holding its breath. Harlan's hand shook, reaching for his gun again, but it slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. The wind howled. The walls groaned. The ground beneath them trembled. "Stop this!" Harlan cried. "You'll destroy everything." The widow's voice was calm, almost tender. It was already destroyed. Lightning flashed outside, flooding the chapel with white light. The stranger shielded his eyes. When he looked again, the widow was standing right before Harlan, her hand hovering near his chest. "Look," she said. Harlan's knees buckled. The light around them grew brighter, the air thick with the sound of a heartbeat. Not one, but many, as if the land itself remembered every life taken. The stranger took a step back, the box still in his arms. The letters fluttered, the wind tugging at them like invisible hands. And then, as the thunder rolled across the valley, he heard the widow's final whisper, low, steady, and full of the storm's edge. "Don't look away." The candles blew out, plunging the chapel into darkness. Outside, Red Creek held its breath. The wind stopped, and the night fell still as stone. But from within the chapel came one last sound, a single, echoing cry that carried through the desert and vanished into the waiting silence. When the thunder faded, and the last echo of the widow's voice drifted into the stillness, the stranger stood frozen in the dark chapel. The air was heavy with dust and smoke. His heartbeat was the only sound for a long moment, steady and alive, as if reminding him that he was still part of the living world. Slowly, he lit one of the fallen candles. Its glow trembled weakly, throwing long shadows across the pews and the cross. Reverend Harlan lay near the altar, his body still. The storm had passed, but something in the air had changed. The chapel no longer felt cursed. It felt lighter, as though a weight had finally been lifted from its foundations. The stranger knelt beside the Reverend and closed his eyes, whispering a quiet prayer. He wasn't sure for whom it was meant, for Harlan's soul, for the widow's peace, or for the land that had carried their sins for too long. He looked down at the old box, its hinges cracked open. The letters and records had scattered across the floor, their ink faded but still readable. They told the story of Red Creek, how greed, fear, and pride had buried truth beneath false faith. Yet even in their ugliness they carried something precious, honesty, the kind of truth that set spirits free. When he stepped outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the ridge. The air smelled of rain, though none had fallen. The desert was quiet, still holding its breath as if waiting to see what would come next. Down the hill, the townspeople had gathered, drawn by the noise and the lightning. Faces peeked from behind doors, cautious and curious. The stranger walked down slowly, leading his horse with one hand and carrying the box with the other. When he reached the square, the sheriff stepped forward, his hat in his hand. "What happened up there?" he asked quietly. The stranger looked around at the people, farmers, mothers, children who had grown up under Harlan's sermons. Their eyes were full of questions and fear. He placed the box on the old well in the center of town. "The truth happened," he said. "The Reverend's gone. The things he buried out there, they're not stories anymore. They're facts. The land remembers." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The barkeep crossed himself. The old woman from the general store came forward, her face pale. "Did you find her?" she asked in a trembling voice. He nodded slowly. "She found all of us." The sheriff picked up one of the letters, scanning the faded handwriting. His jaw tightened. "This'll tear the town apart, or it'll rebuild it right," the stranger said. "You get to choose which." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the woman stepped closer. "I'll help," she said. "It's time we stop hiding from what we've done." Others began nodding, quietly at first, then with more conviction. The sheriff finally looked up. "We'll do it right," he said. "We'll dig up the graves, give them names, and lay them down proper." The stranger felt a slow calm settle in his chest. That was all he'd wanted, for someone to face what had been forgotten. He watched as the people began to move, gathering tools, lanterns, and shovels. They would go to the ridge, to the wash, and give the lost their rest. As the sun climbed higher, he saddled his horse. The barkeep approached, holding a tin cup of coffee. "You heading out?" The stranger nodded. "There's nothing left for me here." "For land," she said. "For the gold in the hills. My husband tried to speak peace, but they shot him where he stood, burned our camp, took my son." Her gaze dropped, her voice barely a whisper. "I found him days later. He was only 10. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that filled the whole desert. You said truth could burn this town," the stranger said finally. "Is that the truth?" She shook her head. "Not all of it. There's something buried here. Something they left behind that proves what they did. I've been waiting for someone who would look long enough to see." He wanted to ask what she meant, but her eyes flicked past him suddenly, alarmed. "Go," she said. "They followed you." He turned. At the ridge's base, lanterns were moving fast, 3, maybe 4 riders. The sound of horses echoed against the rocks. The widow grabbed his arm. "Don't fight them. They don't see truth. They see ghosts. Leave while you still can." But he didn't move. "If what you're saying is true, they don't want me gone. They want me quiet." She met his eyes. "Then you understand." The riders were closer now, silhouettes against the light. The stranger stepped forward, his hand near his revolver. But before he could speak, she vanished into the darkness again, like smoke in wind. The riders circled him. Their leader was the Reverend. His coat flapped open, revealing the pistol at his hip. "You should have listened," Harlan said. "Men who dig up graves never like what they find." "I found a soldier's chain," the stranger said. "And your button," the Reverend's jaw twitched. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do," the stranger said evenly. "You were there. You led them to her people, and now you're afraid the truth will outlive you." Harlan's voice hardened. "The army's gone. Those days are over. You keep stirring this, you'll only bring back pain that should have stayed buried." "Maybe some things need to be dug up," the stranger said. The Reverend's men dismounted, their faces tense. "Then you're no better than her," Harlan said. "And God help you, you'll share her fate." The stranger's hand hovered near his gun, but before anyone could move, a cold wind swept through the ridge. The lanterns flickered, the horses reared, and somewhere among the rocks came that faint, haunting hum, the widow's song. The riders froze. Harlan's face drained of color. "She's here," one of the men whispered. The song grew louder, rising from everywhere and nowhere, carrying grief, fire, and something ancient that refused to die. The lanterns blew out, plunging them into darkness. When light returned, the stranger stood alone. The Reverend and his men were gone, their horses' hoofprints vanishing into the sand as if swallowed by the earth itself. He stared into the night, the sound of her song fading slowly, leaving behind only silence and dust. Whatever truth lay buried beneath Red Creek had woken, and now it was coming for all of them. The morning after the storm of voices and vanished riders, Red Creek woke uneasy. The wind carried an unfamiliar chill, and even the dogs that usually barked at passing wagons stayed quiet. The stranger stood outside the barn, staring toward the ridge. The ground there seemed darker somehow, as if the earth itself had burned during the night. He couldn't shake the sound of her song, the widow's voice rising like wind through the canyon, echoing long after it ended. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Reverend's pale face disappearing into the dark. No sign of him remained. No hoofprints, no dropped lantern, nothing. Just silence. But silence, he'd learned, wasn't peace. It was warning. The barkeep noticed his distant look when he came in for coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the man muttered. "Maybe I have," the stranger replied. The barkeep poured the coffee slow, as if buying time. "Some folks said they heard crying out past the ridge last night. Said it wasn't human." "Maybe it was," the stranger said softly. "Maybe it was someone remembering," the barkeep frowned. "You stir this up anymore, you're gonna bring trouble. Reverend Harlan's been the law in this town for years. You go missing, ain't no one gonna ask questions." "Maybe they should have started asking years ago," he said. "Before the desert did." The barkeep looked at him for a long time, then sighed. "Whatever you're after, I hope it's worth the cost." By noon, the stranger saddled his horse and headed out again. The air was thick with heat, the kind that pressed on a man's chest. He followed the old trail north, the one that curved toward the dry wash. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly. Proof, maybe, or some kind of end. But he could feel something guiding him, like the land itself was drawing him closer. When he reached the wash, he saw a woman standing near the waterline, her dress torn and dusty. It wasn't the widow. It was the woman from the general store. She was kneeling beside something half buried in the sand. He dismounted and approached carefully. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. She didn't look up. "I could say the same to you." He stepped closer and saw what she was uncovering, a metal box, rusted and dented. She brushed away the dirt with shaking hands. "I've known this was here for years," she said. Didn't have the courage to dig it up until now. He knelt beside her. "What is it?" "Records," she whispered. "Orders, letters from the fort. Proof of what they did." She glanced at him, her eyes red. "My father was one of them. He told me on his deathbed. Said they killed women and children and buried them out here like animals. Then they built this town on top of it." The stranger stared at the box. "You kept this secret all these years?" Her voice trembled. "You don't understand." The Reverend was their leader. He called it justice. Said the Apache had stolen cattle. Said they were a threat. But there were no guns in that camp, only families. She swallowed hard. "He baptized my father after it was over. Told him God forgives all things, but some sins don't wash clean." Before he could reply, a sound broke the air, the faint echo of hooves. The woman's face drained of color. "They found us." The stranger stood, scanning the horizon. 3 riders were coming fast, their coats whipping in the wind. One carried a rifle. The sun glinted off metal. "Take the box," the woman said urgently. "Go, I'll hold them off." He shook his head. "I'm not leaving you here. You don't have a choice." She pressed the box into his hands, her voice shaking. "The truth has waited too long already." He took it and swung onto his horse just as the riders closed in. A gunshot cracked through the air, kicking up dirt near his boots. He turned the horse and galloped toward the ridge, the sound of pursuit thundering behind him. The desert blurred past, the dry brush, the rocks, the glint of the riverbed ahead. He rode harder, the wind tearing at his hat and coat. Another shot whistled by his ear. He leaned low, urging the horse faster. When he reached the base of the ridge, he saw her again, the widow, standing still among the stones. She didn't move as he approached, but her eyes followed him. "They're coming," he called. "They want this box." Her gaze flickered to it, then to him. "Then you found it," she said softly. The truth. He could hear the riders closing in. "What's in it?" Everything they tried to erase, she said. The names, the orders, the ones who carried them out. Her eyes darkened. And the curse that keeps them bound. The horses thundered closer. You have to go, she said. Take it to the old chapel. Put it beneath the cross. That's where it ends. He hesitated. What about you? Her eyes softened. You can't help what's already been taken. She turned to leave, but he stepped forward. Tell me what they want. Her voice dropped low. The truth buried here could burn this town to the ground. Before he could press further, she was gone again, swallowed by the desert's shifting light. He stood alone, heart racing, the distant sound of hooves growing nearer. Something about her words didn't feel like warning. It felt like a test. By the time he made it back to Red Creek, the air was thick with tension. 2 riders were in front of the tavern, their coats marked with the insignia of old frontier lawmen. They were asking questions, their voices hard and clipped. The barkeep saw him and gave a slight shake of his head. Silent warning. One of the riders turned, his eyes narrow. You there, he called. You came in last night? That's right, the stranger said evenly. Then you've seen her. He hesitated. Who? The Apache widow, the man said. We've been tracking her for months. She's not what you think she is. The stranger said nothing, his face unreadable. The lawman stepped closer, lowering his voice. If you've been near her, you best forget it. Folks who get tangled up with her don't last long. She doesn't seem dangerous, he replied. The lawman laughed bitterly. That's how it starts. She gets inside your head, makes you see things that ain't there. The desert's full of bones from men who thought they could save her. The stranger watched them ride off, dust swirling behind their horses. His jaw tightened. That night, as the sun disappeared again behind the ridges, he sat alone outside the barn. The same words circling his mind. The truth buried here could burn this town to the ground. He didn't know what truth she meant. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving Red Creek yet. Somewhere beyond the hills, a faint song rose again, carried on the wind like a promise and a warning. And when he turned toward it, he didn't look away. The nights in Red Creek seemed to grow longer after that. The air turned dry and restless, and even the stars above seemed to flicker uneasily, as if they too were waiting for something to happen. The stranger had meant to stay only a night, maybe 2, but something about the widow's voice and the old stories had rooted him there. He spent his mornings helping the barkeep haul water or mend fences, and his afternoons wandering the outskirts, tracing the hills where the wind whispered in strange tones. Every time he thought about leaving, the same thought pulled him back, the truth she'd spoken of, buried deep beneath Red Creek's calm face. One morning, he went to the general store to trade for supplies. The woman behind the counter looked up from her ledger, her eyes sharp but kind. She had the look of someone who'd learned to live quiet but not blind. You're the traveler everyone's talking about, she said. Guess that's me, he answered, setting a small pouch of coins on the counter. I'll take flour, coffee, and maybe a little salt. She began filling his order, her movements precise. You've been seen out near the ridge, she said without looking up. I walk, he said simply. That's not what I meant. She met his eyes then, her voice lowering. The ridge isn't a place for wandering. It's where the past sits heavy. You stir it up, it stirs back. He studied her, hearing both warning and something else. Fear, maybe. Or memory. You knew her, he said quietly. The woman's hands paused. Everyone here did, she said at last. Or at least we thought we did. Before the soldiers came, he waited, but she said no more. The silence between them stretched. Finally, she pushed the bag of flour toward him. Whatever business you've got with her, end it. There's some things in this desert that don't forgive curiosity. He took his things and left, but her words followed him down the street. It wasn't just superstition keeping this town quiet. It was guilt, deep and buried, the kind people learned to live with because digging it up would break them. That afternoon, he rode out toward the ridge again. The sun was hot and sharp, the air buzzing with flies. He followed a dry creek bed that twisted between the rocks until he found something half hidden beneath a fallen branch. A rusted chain, snapped at both ends. Nearby lay a single brass button, dulled with age. He brushed the dust away, frowning. It wasn't Apache made. It belonged to a uniform, a soldier's. Before he could study it further, he heard footsteps behind him. It was the boy again, the one who fetched water. You shouldn't touch that, the boy said, wide-eyed. Why? That's from the raid, the boy whispered. When they came for her people. Grandma says soldiers left things behind, but their spirits never did. The stranger tucked the button into his pocket. Who told you about the raid? Everybody knows, the boy said. But nobody talks about it loud. Not since the preacher came. The preacher? The boy nodded. He came a few years back. Says he's bringing peace to this land. But every time someone mentions her name, he gets angry. Says she's a curse on Red Creek. The stranger thought about that for a long moment. Where can I find him? At the old chapel near the well, the boy said, then lowered his voice. But don't tell him I told you. By the time the stranger reached the chapel, the sun was dipping low. The building stood crooked, its paint flaked away by years of sand and heat. A tall man in a dark coat was sweeping the steps, his shoulders broad and his movements slow but steady. When he saw the stranger, he smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're the new man in town, he said. Name's Reverend Harlan. The stranger nodded. Heard you're the one keeping peace around here. Harlan leaned on his broom. I do what I can. These are hard lands, full of old sins. I try to remind folks there's only one way to cleanse the past. By forgetting it? The stranger asked. By forgiving it, Harlan said. His tone was calm, but something in his eyes flickered. Sometimes people hold on to their ghosts so tight they start becoming one. The stranger hesitated. You know about the widow. Harlan's smile faded. That's a name I don't care to hear. She's gone. Best to let the dead rest. She doesn't seem gone to me, the stranger said quietly. The Reverend's jaw tightened. You've seen her? Maybe. Harlan stepped closer, his shadow long against the chapel wall. Then hear me, son. What you saw wasn't a woman. It was the echo of sin. That ridge holds blood that never should have been spilled. The army did what it had to do back then. There were raids, ambushes. Innocent people died on both sides. But some wounds don't heal right. The stranger studied him, noticing the small scar just beneath the man's collar, half hidden by his shirt. A soldier's wound. You were there, he said quietly. Harlan's eyes turned cold. I was a younger man. We all did things we wish we hadn't. But I made peace with God. You'd be wise to do the same. He turned back toward the chapel, ending the conversation. But the stranger knew what he'd seen in that man's eyes. It wasn't peace. It was fear. That night, the stranger couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, and the barn groaned like it held something breathing inside. He rose and went outside. The moonlight washed the land in silver. He felt drawn again toward the ridge. He didn't take a lantern this time, only his horse and instinct. The desert was quiet except for the crunch of hooves. When he reached the cluster of stones where he'd found the feather, he saw movement, faint and pale. Just beyond the circle, it was her. The widow stood beneath a mesquite tree, her shawl fluttering like smoke. I told you not to come back, she said, her voice carrying through the stillness. I needed answers, he said. About the raid. About the preacher. Her expression changed. Anger, then sorrow. He led them here. The soldiers. He told them where to find us. The stranger felt his chest tighten. Why? The barkeep looked toward the ridge, where the land shimmered faintly in the light. You think she's gone now? The stranger glanced at the horizon. No, he said softly. I think she's finally home. He mounted his horse, pausing as he turned toward the dusty road that stretched west. The town behind him was beginning to stir, people working side by side for the first time in years. The sound of hammers, shovels, and voices carried faintly through the still air. It wasn't sorrowful. It was steady, full of quiet purpose. He rode until the town disappeared behind a rise, the ridge standing tall and golden in the morning sun. For a while he said nothing, letting the rhythm of the horse's hooves fill the silence. Somewhere behind him a bell rang, the chapel's bell. It hadn't rung in years, not since the day of the massacre. Its sound was slow and solemn, yet somehow hopeful. As he crossed the edge of the valley, he stopped and looked back one last time. From this distance, Red Creek looked small and harmless, a handful of rooftops caught in the vast sweep of desert. But it had changed. Maybe that was enough. He opened his coat and pulled out one of the letters he'd kept, a single page written in a shaky hand. It was signed by a soldier who'd begged forgiveness for what they'd done. The stranger folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. It wasn't his burden anymore, but it was a reminder. Some truths needed to be carried, not buried. The road stretched on, winding through red dust and sagebrush. The sky was wide, clean, and endless. Somewhere out there, another town would need help remembering too. He knew how these stories worked. The land never forgot. and neither should the people who lived on it. As the heat began to rise, he removed his hat and wiped his brow. He thought about the widow's final words, the way her voice had sounded, both fierce and forgiving. She hadn't asked for revenge. She'd wanted peace, and now at last it seemed she had it. By afternoon, the desert began to shimmer with mirage. He stopped near a small creek, barely a trickle of water, and let his horse drink. He knelt, running his hands through the cool sand. There, half buried, he found a white stone. It looked ordinary, but something about it made him pause. He brushed it clean and saw faint carvings on one side, a single name weathered by time. He smiled faintly, then set the stone atop a nearby rock. "Rest easy," he murmured. The wind stirred gently in response, soft and warm. As he rode on, the sky began to turn amber. The first stars appeared, sharp and clear. He could almost hear music again, the same low hum the widow had sung before the storm. But now it wasn't sorrowful. It was like a lullaby, carried gently across the plains. In Red Creek, people worked through the night. They lit candles along the ridge, marking each grave they found. The sheriff read the names aloud, even when the wind threatened to steal his voice. The widow's name was among them. When her candle was lit, the air grew still and every flame stood straight, burning bright. Some swore they saw a shape on the hill then, a figure in white, standing in the moonlight. Others said it was just the wind, but either way, no one felt afraid. By the next morning, the town looked different. The chapel doors were open again, and children played near the square without fear. The curse that had hung over Red Creek for decades was gone, replaced by something fragile but real. Hope. Days turned to weeks, and people from nearby towns began to visit, drawn by the story. They called it a miracle, that the land once haunted had become green again after the first real rain in years. The creek flowed stronger. The crops grew taller. The town learned to live with its past instead of hiding from it. The stranger's name faded from memory, as strangers' names often do, but the story he carried stayed alive. Some said he went north, others west, always moving, always listening to the land. Wherever injustice slept, he woke it. Wherever silence lingered, he left truth in its place. And as for the widow, her song never disappeared entirely. On quiet nights, when the wind rolled down from the ridge, the people of Red Creek could still hear it, soft, peaceful, like a mother humming her child to sleep. It wasn't a cry anymore. It was gratitude. In time, a new church bell was cast, engraved with words chosen by the townsfolk themselves. Truth sets the spirit free. They rang it every spring. On the anniversary of the night the storm came, not to mourn, but to remember. The stranger never returned to Red Creek. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, the townsfolk swore they saw a lone rider passing along the horizon. And though no one could ever be sure, they liked to believe that somewhere out there, he still carried one of the widow's songs in his heart. The desert, after all, had a way of keeping its promises, and Red Creek, once built on silence, now stood on truth. A quiet, humble place where ghosts could finally rest, and the living could begin again.